that went to Israel to help the people with food and stuff like that, and they were obviously British, and some died and got injured, and all they were doing was trying to help people, and they told them twice they were going to be in there, and they decided to just rocket launch them and blow them up. Terrible news, I know. They didn't deserve that. Imagine the Houthis and as that other thing kicked off at the time with the Houthis. I'm just trying to think of the Houthis, and that boat's problem was a different story. What are the impacts going to be from this? Will it happen again? I'll just have to watch the video and find out, won't we? And that's really heartbreaking, I know. And then people that have died, I do have sympathy for them. Rest in peace.
I think everyone's noticed that Britain's backing of Israel has been, shall we say, less less fulsome than it was maybe on October the 7th. The rhetoric.
I don't know what the relationship's going to be now because they've done this.
Much more sceptical about Israel, much more sceptical about its prime minister as well, and I think this is linked to the fact that David Cameron is now the foreign secretary. Well, today relations between Britain and Israel, I would say, reached a new low after the killing of 7 aid workers, 3 of them British citizens, by an IDF drone. Now, obviously, we don't know all the details of exactly what happened there, but obviously it's a tragedy. And it will mean that it will make it even more difficult for aid workers to get aid into Gaza. It's much needed.
See, the thing is, all they were trying to do is help them. All us British people do is try and help people like you out there because you've got no food, you've got no money. And there's going to be a lot of angry and annoyed people about this. I'm going to say it because there is. We try and help you because you're in a war zone. We try and help you because people are killing you out there. And you go around, I'm not saying it was the innocent people, it was the people that were in probably the army that have done this, blowing up our trucks. You know, it's either you want help from Britain and America, or you just keep blowing us up and we just won't bring any aid in to your country or drop it off from an aeroplane or whatever, or a cargo plane, or you just struggle. And now you've probably going to ruin the relationship with England, probably, or it may be an accident, or was it done on purpose? You knew that they were coming in. Anyway, let's play the rest of the video and see what we can get out of this.
Mitchell summons Zippy Hotavadi, Israel's ambassador to the UK, to a meeting at the Foreign Office. Now, David Cameron said after his call with the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel must urgently explain how this happened and make major changes to ensure safety of aid workers on the ground.
So you think it could have been a terrorist attack for all I know, but
what is called a
very unlikely.
Statement. He said he set out the government's unequivocal condemnation of the appalling killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers, including 3 British nationals.
So they're talking about the aid workers from the UK that went there to Israel.
The international community and full accountability. So my question to you is this. How can we make it safer for aid workers in Gaza? What is Israel's responsibility here?
Well, how can it to make it safer for aid workers in Gaza, I mean, do they have, like, you can put security in the aid workers' vans and just in case it kicks off? But you can't, if someone's going to be blowing you up with a plane, with a van, you're not going to survive very long, are you? So, you know, something doesn't seem right about this. We'll probably get a bit more of the story in a minute, I think.
973. Greg Carlstrom joins me, Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Greg, very good evening to you. Take us through the events of the day and what exactly happened in this drone attack.
We still don't have an official explanation from the Israeli army, but the story that has come out so far from army sources and people in the defense ministry in Israel is that this convoy of 3 cars had left a warehouse in northern Gaza where World Central Kitchen was bringing aid in by ship from Cyprus. These 3 cars left the warehouse. The first one was targeted by an Israeli drone, which fired a missile at it. The car was damaged. People in the second car tried to pull out the survivors. The second car was then subsequently struck.
Crazy, isn't it?
And then about a kilometer down the road...
Hold on, 2 seconds.
Hey, bitch, don't you get tall me.
Hold on a minute. There's someone else in the background. I mean, I'm trying to film a video. Sometimes you just hear background noises. 2 minutes. Got one of my friends joining me.
Struck as well. So this drone fired 3 missiles in succession at 3 different cars in the convoy, killing the 7 aid workers.
Now, I read somewhere that the organisation had actually liaised with the IDF, and the IDF knew where these cars were going and the route that they were taking. Is that true?
Yeah, my friend joined the party chat.
It is true.
Didn't
World
realise.
Central Kitchen has been one of the groups over
times.
the past few months that the Israelis have actually been happy to work with. They've been trying to minimize the role of UNRWA, the UN agency that aids Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, and they've been trying to focus on working with NGOs to provide aid instead of the UN in Gaza. World Central Kitchen was one of them, to the point where they were given permission by the Israeli military to bring in aid by sea, something that Israel had not allowed to happen for about 2 decades in Gaza. But they coordinated that with World Central Kitchen, and they were coordinating all of the.
Does it make any sense, this video? I mean,
along this coastal road in
I don't know
Gaza
why
City,
they blew up the trucks.
They had run that by the Israeli army in advance. They knew which cars were going to be traveling, when, what road they were going to take. It was all meant to be coordinated.
Which begs the question: how on earth did this happen? If they, I mean, some people are saying, well, this was clearly a deliberate attack. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, called it a tragedy, and issued a sort of semi-apology, even though he did add the phrase, but of course these things happen in wars, if that somehow justified it. People are going to, those who want to think ill of Israel and its government, they've been given a very good excuse today, haven't they?
Sure, and this was a deliberate attack, certainly in the sense that they meant to target this convoy. This wasn't one errant missile. This wasn't an explosion 100 meters away that caused some collateral damage. There's been some reporting in the Israeli media today that they had been monitoring this warehouse before the convoy departed, and they had seen an armed man driving into the warehouse on a truck, and they meant to target this armed man. Whether or not that would justify targeting a convoy that had 7 aid workers in it is one question, but that armed man wasn't even in the convoy in the end. The truck that he was supposedly riding in was not part of this 3-car convoy. So there was absolutely no justification for this attack based on everything that we know so far.
And it hasn't done anything to help British-Israeli relations, which have been on the slide, I think it's fair to say, for some time. The statement made by David Cameron and Andrea Mitchell today, going, I would say, beyond what the diplomatic norms are.
It is, absolutely. And not just Britain, but if you look at the nationalities of these aid workers who were killed, you have 3 British citizens, 1 Australian, 1 American Canadian dual citizen. These are people from countries that have been, for the past 6 months, some of Israel's closest allies, and among the handful of countries that are still defending Israel's conduct in Gaza, defending the war in Gaza. This is now going to do damage to Israel's reputation with a number of key Western allies who, as you say, were already frustrated about the insufficient humanitarian aid in Gaza, about the Israeli army's utter lack of interest in trying to protect civilians in Gaza. This has now added even more strain to these already strained relationships.
Greg, thank you very much. That's Greg Colston, Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Richard Makepeace joins me now, trustee of the charity Medical Aid for Palestinians and former British Consul General to Jerusalem. Richard, good evening to you. Your immediate reaction to the events of the day, and particularly that of the British government?
Well, I mean, it's an absolutely appalling event, but it is not something new, I'm afraid. Medical Aid for Palestinians also had a location targeted by the Israeli authorities, where we were housing a group of brave volunteers, the joint medical team, mounted by us and by International Rescue. By the grace of God, nobody was killed. There were some minor injuries, but as far as we could judge, this was a targeted attack. And there's been no explanation from the Israelis about it. And I think, as the UN have pointed out, this just shows that this is an appalling situation for humanitarians. These deaths bring to more than 200 the number of humanitarian workers who've been killed. And in many cases, these appear to have been targeted attacks. This is not some militia unable, not having the intelligence or the weaponry or the expertise to know a location or to avoid it. This is a modern army with the latest kit, and frankly, it's inexcusable.
What can be done to ensure that it doesn't happen again? Because in the end, that's surely got to be the aim of everybody involved.
Well, I think certainly if the Haaretz report, which was referred to before, is true, i.e. that it was thought justified to target a humanitarian convoy because of the possibility of somebody with a weapon, unknown, being somewhere near, then there has to be a complete change of heart by the Israeli government, and the IDF have to be told that they must be much more careful and that they are basically putting Israel in a very vulnerable position, not just politically, but under international law.
Do you think, though, there is the willingness to recognise that they got this totally wrong and to take measures to ensure that it can't happen again?
Well, let's hope that let's trust that hope can triumph over experience. But I'm afraid the Israelis have a very poor reputation over the course of this war, which has seen absolutely unprecedented targeting of humanitarians to an extent that more have been killed in Gaza than in any conflict, according to the UN, over a one-year period.
What's the one thing you'd like to hear from the Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, I would like to hear that there was a serious mistake, and this is not just one mistake, this is hundreds of mistakes they've made since the beginning of this conflict, that there is going to be a complete change of operational activity.
The damage has been done. People have been killed.
And their officers in the
families
IDF,
and people are never going to be the same.
If they commit crimes such as this, they will be held to account. I mean, this war seems to be not just a war against Gaza, but a war against humanity.
What did you make of Netanyahu's comment where he said, well, of course, these things happen in war? I mean, he has got a point to the extent that there is always collateral damage. If you target a building, you could hit the building next door. But you can't really put this under the heading of collateral damage, can you?
No, absolutely not. And I mean, there's a difference between, everything is about proportionality. You know, there's a difference between, if you like, genuine collateral damage and a war in which, the entire population of Gaza have been targeted, whether through denying them safe drinking water, denying them for food, the destruction of more than half.
It's like the whole world's gone mad again, like per usual.
I think in Gaza, most of the hospitals. This is an absolutely unprecedented situation.
Madness.
And Prime Minister.
Absolutely bloody madness. Be nice to see what they're going to do about it, what's happened, or they talk about it, or whatever. Let's look at the years of under news.
Former chair of the BMA, the GP committee. Joining me to discuss this is the former chair of the BMA, the GP committee, Dr. Lawrence Buckman. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us. To be honest, this doesn't come as shocking as it is, the idea that people are waiting a month to be seen by a GP. It doesn't come as much of a
Some people wait 5 months to see a GP, or a year.
5 years ago, we said it was going to happen. We said roughly when it would happen. The pandemic got in the way and just made it worse. But even without the pandemic, what you're seeing now is a dreadful result of years of under preparation for the large numbers of doctors who were inevitably going to retire over the last 10 years.
All right, so you are saying it was inevitable and that alarm bells were being, rung, and that the government wasn't taking any notice. So is it that we knew there weren't going to be enough doctors and we knew the population was increasing? Is it as simple as that?
Well, no, but that's at least the beginning. It was obvious from the number of doctors who came here in the 60s and 70s that by the time we got to the 2010s, we were going to run out of doctors because they were
Hold on,
going
I'm going to get some
retire.
water, and we can keep talking about this on the TV. Just give me 1 second. My throat's a bit dry. Need some water. Right. I've got the Ghostbusters drink here, as you can see. Ghostbusters. Pretty cool, eh? Advertising new film. But give me 1 second while I have a drink of this, and we'll do some more filming. If you played the game and the film of Ghostbusters and watched it, it's pretty good. Anyway, let's get back to the news.
And people like me, but many others, have been agitating for the last 20 years, warning that this was going to happen. We didn't predict that there would be an expansion of the population, and all that's done is make it worse. But it's not the patient's fault. It's the fact that we don't have enough doctors and nurses working in primary care to deal with the patients who quite reasonably want to be seen. And 17 million people waiting is awful.
Okay, so we know we don't have enough doctors. We knew that a tranche, a demographic tranche of doctors were going to retire, leaving a gap underneath them. Presumably, the answer to that was twofold: to train more Indigenous homegrown doctors and to encourage more doctors to come here from overseas. And yet what we're hearing is that even the doctors we are training here are going overseas. They're not even staying here.
That's right. Most GP trainees, that they're fully qualified doctors who are finally qualifying as GPs who can work independently, most of them take one look at what their seniors are doing and think, oh, I don't want that. And they can go and work somewhere else. Pay is an issue, but it's not really the big issue. The big issue is there's just not enough people working. And bringing foreign doctors from abroad, well, the biggest source of foreign doctors coming into the UK, which was from Europe, has been choked off. There are very, very few doctors who come in now from that source. So we just don't have enough doctors working and available to come into the UK or coming through the pipeline.
I was just looking at some figures today, and these might be a bit out of date, but the UK has 2.8 doctors per 1,000 population, so per capita, which puts us well below the European average, with only 4 countries in Europe having fewer doctors for the size of their population than we do. So we've been at the sort of bottom of the league table for some years now. And then when you look at the number of GPs who work part-time, again, there was a report out in the last couple of years showing that the average GP works 3 days a week.
Yes, that's because GPs, most of them, don't feel they can work for 5 continuous days, where a day is typically between 12 and 16 hours long. People like me were seen as dinosaurs, that we're actually prepared to do a very long day's work. The current generation of doctors don't want to work like that, and they look around the rest of the world and they don't have to. So what is trumpeted as efficiency, in other words, very few doctors per patient, per 1,000 patients, is actually not particularly efficient, because it means people wait. It's a sort of austerity on doctor availability, if you like.
Okay, so we've got fewer doctors doing fewer hours. And you said, obviously, the number of doctors is very important, but does pay come into this? Because, I mean, I can remember, I'm old enough that I was reporting on, it was about 20 years ago, wasn't it, when there was a real blockbusting GP pay rise, which was thought at the time that was going to secure the future of general practice, because GPs had managed to get such a big rise.
Well, I don't want to go into history as one of the people that negotiated it, only to say that that was intended as a catch-up for all the years we've been used as a pay regulator for the rest of the economy. But let's just say money isn't everything. Money doesn't make you less tired. Money doesn't make you work much harder unless the amount of money would be ridiculously high, which is not on offer. This is not really about money. Once you reach a point of exhaustion, you're not going to go on unless somebody really does cross your palm with silver, which is not going to happen. This is the pay rise that we had was to keep the doctors on the field, but those doctors are now wandering off mainly into retirement.
Okay, so what is the answer? You know, people talk about the number of people who don't turn up for GP's appointments, and we know that Wes Streeting has been looking at Australia and perhaps Ireland, where people do pay a bit to go to see the GP. But given we've got a crisis with the number of GPs we've got, I can't really see, whilst I can see the sense in making people pay from a financial point of view and potentially from them not standing the doctor up, I can't see that that would be the solution to such a big problem.
I don't think many of us see that as an answer. Co-payment also has all sorts of political ramifications, and it discriminates against the poor and the chronic sick. So I think that's for politicians to discuss that. But for most doctors would say that what we actually need is a very honest discussion between politics and the people to say, you can't have what you want because there aren't enough people to deliver it. And the same has happened with every branch of medicine. As new treatments have come on stream, as new ideas emerge, the demand for those things appears out of nowhere, yet the workforce resource doesn't expand. So the fact that you don't feel well and want to see a GP is completely reasonable. The trouble is there are not enough people, and we have to explain that. Not enough medical humans needs to be owned up to by the government. And then, obviously, the trick is to recruit and train more. But that takes 5 to 10 years to grow a new GP workforce. It's not going to happen overnight.
Well, exactly. And of course, whilst we're discussing what can be done and the fact there aren't enough GPs and they don't work long enough, you know, potentially is not their own fault, but, you know, the GP surgeries were meant to be staying open later and opening at the weekends, and none of that is really happening. But of course, meanwhile, there is a real impact on this because, I mean, I know from my own experience, I was with a friend just 10 days ago who ended up in an ambulance with me in the ambulance with her. And it was because she hadn't been able to see a GP. She'd been trying and trying and trying. And in the end, it became a crisis. And she had to go to hospital in an ambulance. And of course, again, we know a GP's appointment costs the country about 40 quid. What happened to her will have cost about 400 or even more with the ambulance, hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So not only are you putting extra pressure on hospitals and A&E and ambulance because people can't see their GPs, you're making the nation sicker as well.
That's right. That's right. It's disgraceful. And we've been warning that this was going to come. You can't keep on with an elastic workforce expecting it to go on being elastic. At some point, you can't carry on seeing people. GPs are working flat out. The idea that we do 5 minutes and then go off to the golf course is just, that's ancient history now. Most GPs are working a 12 to 14 hour day, and they don't want to work like that. And it's not in patients' interest either. But the GP can't go on saying, well, I'll fit in another 5 or 6, because there is a point when actually the GP becomes unsafe because they're working too long. And what we need is more people able to see patients in the community. And we've expanded community pharmacy roles and enabled nurses to do more care for the patients. And
get more doctors, get more nurses, get more GPs.
You know,
get more hospitals, get more beds.
Not nurses and not doctors, but who can help
nurses.
With some of
need more nurses.
And many advanced
staff,
practices
security
have
guards,
social workers attached who can deal with things that are really not medical at all.
Police force,
But
ambulance.
At the end of
more
it,
ambulances would be a good idea.
People, I'm afraid the cake is too small for you to get your deserved slice. And that requires
and fire stations, that'd be good, wouldn't it?
People who run the health service, by which I mean the Treasury, they have to own up to the fact there just isn't enough resource, by which I mean people. Yeah. If you just bung money at it, that will not solve the problem. You need workforce.
Craziness.
Yeah. The cake.
It's like the whole world's gone mad.
Yeah.
Does the whole world know what it's doing? Probably not. And these bloody adverts on the TV are so annoying. All right, let's put this on.
Lawrence Buckman. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us. To be honest, extraordinary figures released yesterday showing 250 people a week are dying needlessly because of long waiting times in A&E. That's according to a report from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. Today, it's emerged that people are waiting up to a month to see their GP.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, a month.
Now to discuss this is medical commentator and GP at same-day doctor is Dr. Lawrence Gurlis. Good afternoon to you, Lawrence.
Hi, Julia.
I mean, these figures are absolutely shocking on both counts, aren't they? Just initially getting into the GP.
It's like the GP can't be bothered, the ambulance can't be bothered.
You need. People are dying. We know that. This is, the experts are saying this.
Whole system's broken.
Well, it's tragic, and I try to advise people to keep away from A&E. Part of me is relieved about these figures, because as you know, we've been running at excess deaths since the pandemic. Every week, about 500 to 1,000 people are dying, more than should be compared with the average. And no one's come up with an answer to that. Sir Chris Whitty, who's a sensible chap, said it may be that doctors aren't prescribing statins. I never believed that. At least we now have a partial explanation that some of them are dying because they're not getting timely treatment in A&E. So we know that. As for the rest of them, we're not sure. I think the anti-vax conspiracists like to blame vaccines. It's post-COVID. It's access to general practice. It's all not working. As you say, waiting a month to get in to see a GP. Look, it's Tuesday today. I've been working all weekend. My local GP practice, who I tried to contact on Thursday, has been closed all weekend. That's their contract. That they're not contracted to be open bank holidays and weekends. So where do people
health
go?
is 24/7, 365, and that's. But we even found that even in hospitals, don't we, where people, they'll go in. If you go in on a Friday, your chances of surviving are lower because you can't get the tests you need, and therefore you're not in the treatment. How do we change this though? Is this the same in other countries? Because for years and years, you've had this whole let's worship at the feet of the NHS. And it's now the sacred cow. You can't criticise it. And we're told that we've got the best, the envy of the world. Look, the stats are really clear. Our health service is far from being the envy of the world. It's something of a laughing stock. Eastern Europe, Western Europe, most other Western nations, bar America, don't have any system like this, and they still get their healthcare. So, do we need to start having a sensible debate and say, it may not be the funding, because huge sums of money have gone in. It may be the system itself that is the problem.
Julia, I've been having this sensible debate with a lot of people for a lot of years, and I've come to the conclusion, this is slightly depressing, it's never going to change in this country. Never. The NHS is a state within a state with so many tribes, so many lobby groups, so many self-interests. It's impossible to change. And especially with what's going to happen after the next election, it's not going to change. And I know that's depressing. I agree with you. Of course, it should change. I just want to tell people there is no secret plan to privatise the NHS. A lot of people say, oh, well, the government's running it down so they can privatise it. That has never been the case. It's one of these scare stories that people like to bring up. Jeremy Corbyn at the last election saying, oh, we're going to sell the NHS to Donald Trump. Every election, someone threatens this. There's never been that plan. It's never going to happen.
But a lot of people are now waking up in terms of satisfaction with the NHS and understanding that actually, it's not delivering. And it's not delivering for a huge sum of money that's being spent on it. For some reason, we seem to hire more, bureaucrats than we hire more doctors and radiologists and the like. People who come from Eastern Europe, they go back to Eastern Europe to get treatment and then come back here. That should be a source of national humiliation for us.
Well, everything is humiliating. But if you ask people what the answer is, no one says, I want to pay to see a doctor, or I want to pay to take out insurance. No one says that. They say we need to put more money in, but I'm not paying more tax. People should.
But again, people say it's free. It's not free. We're paying for it. Lawrence Gurlis, thank you very much indeed. Tom Slater's still with me. I'm NHS GP's daughter. I don't want anyone to not go to the doctor because they can't afford to. Mm-hmm. But the NHS has expanded so much and the cost so much. But we spend a fortune. We have huge sums of money going into the NHS. So what's going wrong?
I think what's going wrong is the absence of that debate and the ridiculous scare stories that take place. When people say in opinion polls how much they appreciate the NHS, that's a reflection of the principle of free at the point of use. People are
Or they like their own personal GP.
They like their own personal GP. They've had good experiences. It is not a reflection of. I really love this bureaucratic, centralised, wasteful structure that uses fax machines. So
well, you would think there'd be less bureaucracy because you haven't got all the private, all the social security system, the sort of that you've got in other European countries. You'd think that it would be more efficient, but apparently not.
No, absolutely not. And there's a reason that no one has looked to emulate the way in which we do this. And what's depressing at the moment is that both parties have a very clear vested interest in not rocking the boat too much. Labour, because of its connection with the unions, and the Tories, because they're terrified of looking like they're going after the NHS.
But meanwhile, of course, all the people who are in charge all can get private healthcare because they can afford it, so they can walk their way out of the system. Tom Slater, pleasure to have had your company all today. Thank you very much.
Madness for the news. See what else is on this TV that we can have a look at. There's never a great deal of things.
We start with calls for Palestinian refugees in Gaza with family in this country to be allowed to move to the UK. Almost 60 groups, including the Refugee Council and Care for Calais, want Home Secretary James Cleverly to start a Ukraine-style visa scheme. Around 174,000 Ukrainian refugees moved to the UK after Russia's invasion in February 2022. And authorities in Gaza say more than 30,000 people have been killed in the territory since Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October. Well, joining me now to discuss this is former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Philip, welcome to the show. We have no idea who currently comes into Britain over the channel. We know full well that there is a war in Gaza. It's a war that ostensibly Britain has taken the opposing side on by backing Israel. We know that in 1992, when 321 Palestinian refugees were taken to Denmark, 64% of them went on to have criminal records. What could possibly go wrong, Philip, with bringing these people to Britain?
Well, with Hamas inexorably integrated into the population, that would be very difficult.
They may attack the UK.
Who is Hamas?
If they bring them over.
Who isn't Hamas? And that's the reason why this argument and this
from
cry
Ukraine
is,
and
it's
Gaza, they may start bombing the UK.
The Palestinian people inside Gaza can't get out. They can't get out because the Egyptians aren't letting them across the border because of Hamas's links to the Muslim Brotherhood, and Egypt doesn't want Palestinian refugees in its country. No other Arab country wants Palestinian refugees in there because of their historical links into causing disruption. And then the only other way that they could potentially get out is through Israel. And Israel's not going to let Palestinians come out through the borders to go elsewhere. So, yeah, it's great, these organizations saying we should allow this. They're doing it merely to make noise.
Yeah, and the Ukrainian scheme, of course, is very, very different. We were fighting on the same side. We culturally have a lot in common. And let's not forget, it was only women and children, because the men, of course, of conscription age at least, had to remain behind to fight. The truth of the matter is that we have absolutely no clue who we were letting into the country, and it's absolutely within the realms of possibility that Hamas would specifically and deliberately place individuals within this civilian group to try and cause us harm, surely.
Oh, 100% they'd try and do that. And Hamas would stop lots of legitimate individuals wanting to get out. That is, if those individuals have got the paperwork that would need to be able to prove that they've got these links and everything else. And of course, we've got no consular access into Gaza. So again, yeah, it's great, these groups making all these calls and causing all this noise, but nobody's thought it through. There's no practical solution to it whatsoever. The situations are completely different, and the threat to the UK by allowing people in who we cannot necessarily confirm exactly who they are is too great, far too great.
Philip, we had Kevin Maguire in from the Mirror earlier on, and he was saying, well, why not have an identical scheme where women and children are allowed? We're concerned about Hamas military-aged men, as it were, but does that still carry risks? I mean, terrorists come in all shapes and sizes, don't they?
Yeah, we've got, look at Shamima Begum, who went off to join ISIS one of the most horrible terrorist organizations that there is in the world. Women can equally be members of terror organizations and carry out things, but it's the practicalities of it. Hamas won't let the people out. Egypt won't let the people into Egypt to be processed. Israel won't let the people into Israel to be processed. And we've got no consular access into Gaza whatsoever. So there's no mechanism in place at the moment for a visa scheme to be put in place, even if it were justified in any way, shape or form. So it's completely different to Ukraine. It's completely different to anything else that's there. Impractical, and it's just making noise for noise's sake.
Philip, we've had hundreds and hundreds of emails, and the most common one that we're having is one from Adam Brooks, friend of the show. No, there's plenty of Middle Eastern countries surrounding them, not our place, we have no room. But of course, Philip, historically, we've seen Palestinian refugees, for example, going into the Lebanon, and that led to a 15-year civil war.
Well, it did, and across the whole of the Middle East, we've got large Palestinian populations in the West Bank, in Israel, which cause Israel a security problem. But that's partially stirred by the more extreme elements of the Israeli Jewish community taking over land by force in places. But of course, the Palestinian Authority had a civil war which lasted almost a week with Hamas. Whenever Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. So there's issues amongst the Palestinian people. None of the other Arab countries want. Even Lebanon, with your Lebanese Hezbollah, would not necessarily want all of the Palestinian people to go up there. They've got their own problems. But Egypt has got capacity, has got space, will not have them. Jordan is one of the countries that's most closely linked to Palestine, and the people have similar backgrounds. Jordan doesn't want them, and none of the other Arab countries do. So this call for the UK to take on more and more individuals, or for other countries in Europe for dealing with massive crisis of movement of people anyway, is just out there to create noise and try and create headlines.
Superb. Thanks for joining us on the show. And that's former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram, MBE. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Crazy. Gonna see what else is on it. After these bloody adverts.
Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to repeat his commitment to doing Rafah, and the US is not saying you can't do it under any circumstances. They seem to be saying, here's how we would like you to do it more clinically, how they would have any faith at this stage, 6 months next week, that is what will eventually play out. Has the mind boggled? Now, by the way, Rafah is not happening at the moment because Israel does not have the troop availability. Israel is not prepared militarily yet to do that. It needs some weeks to be able to cycle back reservists and redeploy others of its military. By the way, part of that might be a question of how much of the Israeli military is deployed in the north, on the Lebanon border, where we have seen further signs of an escalation.
What will Israel, the Israeli ambassador, be saying this afternoon to the British Foreign Secretary? What will Israel be saying to America, whose concern and displeasure is very clear?
I will leave that to the Israeli ambassador, who has a track record of being quite open and transparent about Israel's opposition to peace in the past, to make their statements. What we have heard from the Israeli side is what we normally hear. This is Hamas's fault. They hide in these convoys. Perhaps this was an error. It will be investigated. The investigations never go anywhere. It's taken this bombing, British workers gone out there to try and get some alleviation to the people of Gaza, to get this kind of attention. The person behind this entire initiative is an extremely well-known kind of Washington culinary celebrity, Jose Andreas. But what we've seen continuously is journalists killed, UN workers killed, and Palestinian civilians killed. There's not been much of an ask or demand on Israel to investigate those killings, but better late than never. At least attention is now on how Israel is conducting its targeting. And I'll just give you the headline right now in the Israeli Haaretz media. that the convoy was bombed 3 times, targeting a Hamas member who wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to an Israeli government spokesman earlier who cited that report in Haaretz, and his answer was that Haaretz is a left-wing news organ, and suggested that made it less credible. But it is also surely plainly apparent to the Israeli leadership now that the patience of its important allies, the United States, and also the United Kingdom, is running out, and that must have implications for their conduct of the conflict.
I'd like to think so, but I think it's only fair to push that question back and ask, is that patience of the US, of the UK, of the Allies really running out? Because we saw the reports, John, in the weekend media here in the UK, that the legal section in our government has made a designation that Israel is in violation of international law, and that is incumbent on the UK government, according to its own procedures, to cease arms exports to Israel. But the government is slow walking that. We haven't seen the Prime Minister make that decision. We haven't seen that stop. And perhaps more to the point, because this is where the endless flow of weapons is really coming from the US, much less so from the UK. We saw the reports again just in the last days in the Washington Post and elsewhere that there have been yet more of this conveyor belt, not just of any weapons, but of these extremely heavy ordnance bombs, which have caused so much destruction. On another incident earlier in this war, they went after one Hamas guy. Apparently, they killed 100 civilians. It's ordnance that Western states do not use anymore because of its destructive capacity in urban built-up areas. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that the Israeli Prime Minister is not feeling the kind of heat that will lead Israel to really revisit what it is doing here, given the level of death and destruction against innocent civilians. Remember, it was on day 1 of this war that the Israelis announced that they would prevent food, fuel, water, electricity getting to the civilian population. That's why there's a humanitarian catastrophe. That's why we need this aid in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty right to point out, isn't it, Daniel, it is not established that government lawyers have advised ministers and other officials in the British government that Israel is in breach of international law. I mean, there's speculation on that, and there have been demands from some, including the opposition in Westminster, to see that legal advice, but so far it has not been forthcoming, and you imagine it's not likely to be. I mean, do you believe Rafah, the invasion of Rafah, is then still a live option despite the public warnings from people like America?
I very much do, John, because Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to repeat his commitment to doing Rafah, and the US is not saying you can't do it under any circumstances. They seem to be saying, here's how we would like you to do it more clinically, how they would have any faith at this stage, 6 months next week, that is what will eventually play out. That has the mind boggled. Now, by the way, Rafah is not happening at the moment because Israel does not have the troop availability. Israel is not prepared militarily yet to do that. It needs some weeks to be able to cycle back reservists and redeploy others of its military. By the way, part of that might be a question of how much of the Israeli military is deployed in the north.
The future of money is staying on top of your subscriptions, even seeing ones you forgot to cancel. All eyes on Revolut. Download the app today and see why over 8 million others in the UK have too.
This place is so weird. It's a Twilight Zone.
I guess aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on.
Sure.
Look at the tops of the buildings. We're just passing through. We're American. What kind of American are you?
We're going to DC before anyone else does. That's the job. You're so close.
From the Lebanon border, where we have seen further signs of an escalation. So this is, of course, about Gaza, but also now, I think we are closer than ever to a broader regional conflagration, although that's not yet given.
Right, just the last word on internal pressure. As one who knows Israel well. We hear there's a good deal of dissent in Israel about the rule of Benjamin Netanyahu. You don't hear there's a huge amount of pressure, unless I'm wrong, you don't hear there's a huge amount of pressure from Israel to change its tactics and strategy in Gaza. Israeli people are clearly significantly worried about the plight of the hostages in Gaza, but not about the death toll among Palestinians. Is that an accurate reading?
It is, John, and it's a really important point you raised, but there is a connection. In other words, yes, there's not, amongst the Zionist mainstream of the Jewish community, there's not a pushback on what's going on, but there's a real fault line there, as you suggest, on what priority should be accorded to hostages coming first or continuing with the war effort. And the protests in the last days have been unprecedented inside Israel to prioritize getting a deal, getting the hostages out. And that's what one would like to see the US working with Qatar and Egypt to put a package on the table which pulls together getting the hostages out and getting a ceasefire. We haven't seen that yet. If that was put on the table, then I think there'd be real pressure on Netanyahu, especially if there were threats regarding the weapons. Then his war cabinet would have a dilemma, his military would have a dilemma, and I think you'd see greater public mobilization.
Right, just a last question, and we can only speculate about this, but if and when there is a hostage deal, and if that happens, it becomes clear that many of the hostages are in fact dead, do you anticipate that would have the impact of hardening Israeli opinion, making it more militant?
Look, there are even reports in the Israeli press increasingly as to that reality. That this is not going to be the numbers that are often talked about who are still being held. I think if there's going to be a chance of getting a significant cohort of hostages out alive, time is running out. Time's of course running out for the civilian population in Gaza. The way I think this might play out, John, is the first phase would probably involve most of those still alive. And then it would not become clear, and I don't think Hamas will clarify this, how many after that are still alive. And so the goal would be, in that first phase, to try and maximize the implausibility of a continuation of what we've seen in the last 6 months. And I think that's possible to do. I think at some stage, Israel is going to wake up from
Pringle.
October 7th and post-October 7th and question whether this was the right way to
barbecue Pringle.
I don't think it's gone well on the battlefield.
Texas barbecue.
Yes, hearts are hardened, but at some stage,
Pringle.
I think people are
Texas
say,
barbecue.
Is this working out for us?
Texas barbecue.
I hope that's what we see eventually.
These are all pretty dark thoughts. Daniel Levy, thank you for
barbecue, Texas. What's you gonna do?
Now for more.
Don't mind me. Pringle.
I'm joined by former Minister of State for the Middle East, Alistair Burt, and military analyst, Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, Alistair, if I may come to you first. In terms of politics, it's quite unusual to have call in an ambassador. I'm assuming that Lord Cameron is taking this pretty seriously, and the Israeli ambassador got a pretty major dressing down.
I think that's right. My understanding is it was Andrew Mitchell, the Deputy Foreign Minister, who saw her. I think that's the case. But you're quite right. It would have been a very terse exchange. The Israeli ambassador is not a diplomat. She's a politician who was appointed to this position. She has known very strong views on Israel's position. But representing the state as she does, I think the UK government would have demanded a very clear explanation as to what has happened. That will have to come in time. But I would imagine Andrew Mitchell would also have been very clear with her about the circumstances regarding getting aid into Gaza, which Israel is preventing in sufficient quantities, and also the conduct of the reprisal to the appalling terrorist act of Hamas of October the 7th. I would imagine that the British government's view is that the reprisals are of such intensity and almost disproportionate in relation to the number of civilians killed that they're looking for Israel to take a different course of action in the future.
Now, I wanted to dig a little deeper into that because, of course, October the 7th is very often forgotten by many who seem to think that that doesn't matter. They also seem to think
Flying
that
saucer.
Which the British government...
No way, it's a
UFO. Because that's
it's a flying saucer, people.
Is in some shape or form or should be listened to
Flying
when it comes
saucer.
to dealing with this. They could have ended this on day one if they had recognised that Israel exists and recognised that Jewish people shouldn't have to die either in Israel or indeed around the world. So we've got a major problem there, and politically speaking, the UK government has stuck up for Israel, supported Israel. Now, we knew things were reaching breaking point for Israel and the conflict. Is this it?
It might be, but we have to define some terms carefully when you say breaking point. Firstly, I specifically mentioned the Hamas outrage because it shouldn't be forgotten. Hostages were taken quite illegally, and if the hostages were returned as they should be tomorrow, then the situation would look different. Nothing excuses or justifies the actions of October the 7th, but equally, that is not a reason for the consequences which we have seen thereafter in terms of Israel's reprisals to be without question or without judgment. And the number of civilians that have been killed, over 30,000, the prospect of more if there is an attack on Rafah. And what seems to many military experts, and you can talk to Sean about this, the impossibility of continuing military action to try to destroy Hamas at the same time save the hostages has seemed to many to be an impossible mission. And every day, Israel's situation gets worse in the minds of the public, notwithstanding what happened on October the 7th. And I think other friends of Israel, friends over a long period of time, are stretched to breaking point because we are seeing not only Israel's position being disturbed, it's seeming unlikely to resolve issues between Israel and the Palestinian people, which must now inevitably involve West Bank and East Jerusalem, which we don't talk about very much. And whether or not there is to be some greater regional instability, we saw the attack by Israel yesterday, we assume, on Iranian interests in Syria. The situation is getting more and more difficult for everyone concerned, and accordingly, unless something changes, the risk of this running even further out of control is very great. And perhaps today's incident will remind people just how awful the situation really is.
How much responsibility does the West have to take for the fact that it dealt with, and arguably Obama dealt with Iranian interests in such a sort of manner that nobody listened to Israel's concern? Israel is now pretty much ignoring anything that comes from elsewhere because from their perspective, they see Iranian interests as a threat.
I can see you.
Them on directly.
Yes, I can.
Does that now mean that we have to expect
Means
things
the Pringle.
to escalate, or can they be
I can see you. Yes, I can see you.
Well, again, hold on a minute. Israel's relationship with Iran and the hostility between them is well known. Whether Israel acted wisely in persuading Donald Trump to move away from the so-called nuclear deal, by which Israel's any military ambition of Iran was being curtailed by the JCPOA, the Joint Conservative Plan of Action. Israel never liked that, nor did one or two others in the region. But at least while that was in place, Israel's stock of enriched uranium was minimal and being decreased, and that's now a very different situation because it's no longer bound by that. Iran and Israel fence with each other, but at the same time, other states in the region have been trying to find different ways to approach Iran because no one wants a regional confrontation which would draw in a lot of other states. If Israel is taking action now that risks that regional confrontation, other states are going to have a say. So none of this will be settled unilaterally. None of this, I think, will be settled by military action in the region, which doesn't tend to settle anything. It simply causes further problems. So the whole situation is crying out for the comprehensive settlement between Arab states and Iran, Israel and its neighbors, and Israel and the Palestinians. Because the longer the conflict goes on, the more risky it gets for everyone, not least those who are currently being the victims of October the 7th, and the victims in Palestinian Gaza today.
Alistair Burt, former Minister of State for the Middle East, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Talk TV. Now let's turn our attention to Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, military analyst. So, Sean, if we look at what happened, it would appear, and I guess
Hello again.
See, that this was a deliberate act by Israel because they targeted a convoy. Those people escaped the vehicle that had been hit into another vehicle that then got hit, and then into another vehicle that got hit. So we're beginning to see that this is probably a consequence of a horrendous mistake, but a calculated horrendous mistake. How on earth do we untangle what has actually happened here, and can we ever get to the truth?
Well, you're taking a few leaps of faith there, James, I have to say. Going from what we know, the story's actually been developing through the day, because initially, as you know, there's lots of aid available for, but you just can't get across the border into Gaza. There's ships, therefore, coming from Cyprus, one of the aid organisations that was picking up the aid from those vessels and actually transporting it. The initial story was that there was an aid convoy, and that's one of the vehicles was blown up as part of that. Subsequently turned out that wasn't the case. The aid workers at the end of their shift were in 3 vehicles, 2 armoured and 1 not armoured, making their way away from the centre of Gaza down back to Rafah, but the route they took was down the coast. And what the evidence we know is there are 3 vehicles that have been destroyed, and they are separated by about 2.5 kilometres, which is strange because you'd normally in a convoy be close together. Now, social media is rife with this theory that people were stopped, get in the next vehicle, get in the next vehicle. To date, there's no evidence for that, and I don't want to be purporting hearsay.
But that's the reason I asked the question, because we, for the first time, are seeing a war which is being fought not only militarily, but also on social media and with a huge amount of misinformation as well, and particularly by people who have an axe to grind, that they wish to destabilise the support for Israel, that they don't wish to see any kind of support for an Israeli state because they have a completely different objective. So as a nation here in the UK, we support or have supported Israel to date. There are, however, very significant protests here at home. But then also when you hear from Alistair that a military solution, if you like, is not going to be achievable and therefore peace has to be achieved, at what stage do we, as an international power, have to say to Israel, look, enough?
Well, even if we got to the stage to say enough, whether Israel would actually stop or not is a completely different matter. I think as a former military guy, we've spent years studying the region. I can say unequivocally that nearly every military analyst will tell you there is no military solution to what's happening in Gaza today. There's never been a military solution. Ultimately, a political solution is one that has to be found where 2 nations effectively can live and coexist together. Fighting, will that make Israel any safer than it was before the 7th of October? The visceral hatred that's been built up, the over 33,000, I think, killed, 70,000 injured, most of those are women and children because they were caught in the buildings. Is that really going to make Israel safer? Now, there's a lot of anger around this. Yes, it's got past the point of initially, 7th of October, it felt like there was a justification for Israel to protect itself. But as Alistair said, we've got to the stage now where I think that a lot of commentators are saying, hang on a minute. I think, though, going back to that attack, there's no doubt that Israel fronted up almost immediately and said, this is a mistake. It's a pretty grave mistake. But when you look at how you identify buildings at night, yes, they've got uniforms, but the fact is, when you're in an aircraft, I used to fly one, it's quite difficult to see that. I think it was a dreadful, horrible mistake.
Don't know what else to say about that.
The bigger implication of it was now ships are turning away from Gaza, going back to Cyprus, making the humanitarian situation even more difficult.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your analysis and thought.
Anyway, better go. Thank you for all joining me.
The Foreign Office
See you in the next video. Peace.
Israel's ambassador to the
Take it
UK,
easy.
Zippy Artavelli, in to meet UK officials. David Menzer joins us.